Hi, BookTube. This is Peg at the History Shelf, along with my fellow BookTubers and friends, John David. Say hi, John.
Hi.
And Sharon, go for it. Hi, Sharon.
Hi there.
Yay. We are going to be doing today a little BookTube Buddy Reads chat. We recently finished reading a book together, and we've been seeing, well, I know I've been seeing, and I think you guys have too, that other folks on BookTube are starting to have discussions together, which I think is a really fun part of BookTube. And I just want to continue that trend and see if we can get more people getting on these Zoom chats and talking to one another, because it's just fun. I just love being able to talk with you guys rather than just reading in isolation. So this is our inaugural Buddy Reads chat. Well, if we rename it later, great. But today we're going to talk about The American Mind by Henry Steele Commager. And then I'm going to kick it over to John, and he's going to tell us all about who Mr. Commager was.
So Henry Steele Commager, we're going to be talking about this book, by the way. It is The American Mind, an interpretation of American thought and character since the 1880s. And it's not up until current day. It's through about 1920 or so. Henry Steele Commager was a famous American historian, very prolific, wrote over 40 books, and led a pretty long life. He lived to be 95 years old. He's usually known as someone who took up even though when we read the book today, we may not necessarily think of it as liberal in the contemporary sense of the word. He was known as a proponent of modern liberalism in American historiography. He spent almost his entire career in the classroom. He taught at New York University, Columbia University, and then spent most of his career at Amherst. He taught for 62 years at all three of those schools, and died in 1998 at the age of 95. This book that we're going to be talking about today was published in 1950. So there are just certain things to keep in mind. We're sort of, right at the beginning of the Cold War. These are terms that he doesn't really explicitly use because they're not really in modern parlance yet, but they are interesting to just sort of think about as he's choosing the things to talk about during the book.
Okay.
Should we actually jump into how much we love chapter 1?
Yes, I think our audience would love that.
Let's talk about that.
I'm going to give Sharon the floor on that one.
So I'll share my experience with chapter 1. I read it, and my first impression was this book has not aged very well. It very much shows its time and shows its wear in its first chapter. I mean, things did get better, but it has this sort of, at least to me, this like nationalistic bent, like America as this. And I mean, I'm willing to admit that America is unique in a number of ways, but he comes just short of saying that America is, Jesus was on the founding fathers' left shoulder when they were signing that Constitution. I mean, he was just ordaining the founding of this country, which apparently about 25% of the American population actually believes. So I mean, hey, who am I to say that's not the case? But yeah, other impressions of chapter 1?
Well, do you really want to hear what I thought?
Yes, absolutely.
Let her rip. I found it to be, it's whitewashed, it's nationalistic, capitalistic overview of the beginnings of the U.S., and it's complete and utter BS.
Woo!
That's
I love it.
That's it in a nutshell.
You can always count on Sharon to just
throw this book across the room when I was reading, which you both know. You both know my reaction to this book. I hadn't even gotten through the first couple of pages, and I was ready to hang it up. Now, that said, once I got through chapter 1, you know, and did my hate read of it, then I calmed down a little bit, and I was able to get through the rest of it until the end. But yeah, it was just really, really bad. His description, I think where I have the biggest problem with him is the fact that he never really comes out and says any of this, but it's in the way it's worded. His view is that America is white. That's who Americans are. That's who he's talking to. That's who he's talking about. They're white males. That's it. There's no mention of
and middle to upper class.
Yeah. And it's not until he gets into the later chapters that he starts talking about the working class slightly. But even then, it's not, anywhere where it should be. But he's very misogynistic. He's very nationalistic. It's just, and you talked about him, John, spending time in the classroom. When I did a little Google search on him just to find out a little bit more about him, it said that he had a co-author with him. There was someone else involved in the writing of these books, but he wrote textbooks, history textbooks that were used in the classrooms at least until like the late 70s or early 80s. And, you hear people talk about how horrible the textbooks were, the history textbooks were, what we were fed in school. Here's your guy right here. That's what he wrote.
I think the other,
and I have the sneaking impression that it was probably a lot worse than this with other writers. But
yeah, I think the other writer
it could be. He wasn't the only one, but
Yeah, I think it was Samuel Eliot Morison, who I purchased a huge set on the World War II history of the naval warfare in World War II. So I was startled to read that he had co-wrote a textbook.
Yes.
Called The Growth of the American
Republic.
Oh yeah, that was the one. So
I have those. I found them in a library book sale the other day. Yes.
I know you're gonna rush right out and read it now.
It's 2 volumes. Yes, I have it. I think one of the weak points about chapter 1 is that he's trying to talk in generalities, and that it gets stronger as you go into the body of the book, because he actually takes up individual subjects like literature, journalism, economics, and individual figures and individual topics. Whereas when he tries to keep things general, it just gets a little too, like Sharon said, whitewashed.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was very subjective. And I know the nature of the book is an interpretation of American thought, right, and character. I'm just not used to reading such a full-throated, subjective take on what he thinks the American mind is. And he wrote it so authoritatively, like, this is what the American mind is. This is what the American character was. And it's like, well, that's open to a broader interpretation and a lot of disagreement, So I did understand while I'm reading it that this is one man's opinion, but it took me back to, like, another era that I really, frankly, just didn't want to be in.
Wow.
Well, Sharon said that things got better for her as she went into chapter 2 and beyond. Peg, is the same thing true for you?
Yes, because he started talking about people, literature. And then I was intrigued because we're talking about individuals and his take on what they brought to science, politics, law, literature, the study of history. So to me, that was intriguing, and it did give me ideas for further reading. And I think, Sharon, you had mentioned that too, like, especially in the literature sections, a lot of these people never heard of before, or I don't think any of us had heard of before.
The other problem that I have with this book, not just chapter 1, but the book in its entirety, and you both know that I feel this way as well, is the fact that there are 0 notes. 0. There's an index and there's a kind of sort of bibliography. That's it. There are no notes. He has no statistics to back up. And he even, at one point, I don't have time to go through and find out exactly where it was that I wrote it down, where he even said something about, he mentioned some kind of statistics. He just said statistics. He didn't say what they were. There's no reference to refer back to it. So where's he getting his information from? I mean, and he's supposed to be a historiographer. I would think that he would want the facts, but maybe that wasn't important to him. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, John, do you know if was this not something that was, called for back in the 1950s? If you were a prominent teacher or lecturer or professor, were you not?
Well, I think this is one point that we talked about on Voxer. We had a Voxer group in preparation for this. Anyone who happens to be watching, and right after we talked about chapter 1, we talked about this point exactly, and I suggested, this may or may not be the case, that because it is meant more as a work for a popular audience, albeit a well-educated audience, but it's not a scholarly book, that he left it out perhaps for that reason. That a lot of people, when they're reading a work of history, are probably not like Sharon, Peg, and me, eager to jump to the back of the book and to check sources. We're probably, there aren't a lot of history readers out there anyway,
yeah.
And the few that there are probably just reading it for the history/narrative aspect of the writing, and not to, check
extra sources and make sure that this is a credible book.
Now he absolutely did, because of the nature of his career. I mean, he was teaching from 1930 to 1992. You don't get jobs at places like, Amherst and Columbia and New York University and not publish in academic peer-reviewed journals. So if you go and look up, books like that, articles like that, there's going to be a lot of things, but he also wrote things for more popular audiences as well. And that's just what I took this to be.
Right.
Well, then we can agree to disagree.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Oh, I didn't even realize. Are we disagreeing somewhere?
No,
I
wasn't disagreeing. I was just offering a possible explanation as to why there's no notes.
Okay.
I mean, I could be totally wrong. I have no idea, but that's just one possible reason.
Right.
Maybe I should state the reason that makes me uncomfortable is it makes me wonder just how credible he is. It's a credibility issue for me, but that's just me. So
we now have unlimited minutes.
Yeah, I just saw that. Hey, everybody! They got to see that on a recording.
Who did that?
I didn't do it. I think Zoom.
I didn't do it either.
Someone just gave us. We have a message, Sharon, that we have unlimited time on this video, so we don't have to worry about 40 minutes.
The gods must really be enjoying our conversation.
Even though for our viewing audience, we are trying to keep this to 30 minutes because we know that your time is valuable. Our sanity is valuable. This book, maybe not so much. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
So as we move into the body of the book, past chapter 1.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want to go chapter by chapter because I think there's something like 20 chapters.
Yeah.
What actually stood out? There's quite a bit about literature. There's stuff about the law towards the end of the book, how changing conceptions of jurisprudence were important in how we decide cases. There's a strain all throughout the book about the importance of Darwinism and how how it changed how we think about both science, but also religious practice, literature, of course. There's a lot of strains to pick up and go with if we want to talk about them. So what was most interesting?
Yeah, Sharon, I know you've got a lot of notes. I'd love to know.
Go ahead, Peg, you go first.
Oh, well, as I told you guys as we were reading it in the Voxer group, that the literature sections are, something that I need to work on, as far as I haven't read a lot of these things in these books that he was talking about, or these authors. So I kind of was looking more towards you guys, because I know you've read a lot more of the classics, or, quote unquote classics. So I think literature would be a great topic to start it on. And if you guys, I'd look to you for that part. But
yeah, I'm looking through my notes here, and I noticed he uses some interesting terminology that I don't know is used today to kind of, and this is my assumption, and John, you can certainly feel free to correct me if you think I'm mistaken, in how he refers to different time periods of literature as it relates to the time periods that he's discussing. The 19th century, mostly with the literature, he starts like post-Civil War. 19th century literature, and then they move into turn of the century, in that chapter on the 1890s, and then that literature, and then you move more into what we would consider like the modern literature. And he gives them interesting names, like he talks about determinism in literature, and then he talks about trying to find my notes here. Yeah, he has determinism. He had chapter 6 was determinism in literature. Then 7 was the cult of the irrational. That I love that chapter name. I thought that was great. That's where he's talking about. That's what his description of modernists, and he's pretty dismissive of them, as he's calling them irrational. And then he goes goes backwards a little bit. Then he talks about the traditionalists, and that would be, he puts Edith Wharton and Willa Cather and is it Dorothy Canfield, kind of in that box, where they're transitioning between the 19th century and the 20th century. But I thought he had a really good discussion on William Dean Howells, and I wasn't really, John, I know you can speak more to Howells than I can, but it made me want to read him. I think it's going to be very interesting to read. And then he gets into the populists a little bit, and that's Frank Norris and Hamlin Garland, who was another author I was completely unfamiliar with, but John, I think you have at least some familiarity with him.
Very little, but yeah, I've read a couple of his short stories.
Right. Well, that's more than I have.
Yeah, yeah, more than me as well.
Yeah, and he's just talking about one author that I noticed he did not mention, at least in this context and in that transitional period, and that I think would be really important, is Upton Sinclair. He wrote, was it The Jungle? And I think that was published about 1906. And I think that fits right in with his talk on the determinists, and how they were getting away from this pastoral regional kind of literature that was popular after the Civil War, and then they're getting more into, because all the social issues and everything that was coming up, the issues with poverty and with labor and just all the social stuff going on. That's what Theodore Dreiser and Frank Norris, and I think Upton Sinclair would fit in there as well, but I didn't really see where he mentioned him much.
There's one paragraph on page 141. It's the first paragraph of chapter 8, where he kind of he does a short little I'll just read it, and he sort of describes those classes of novelists you were talking about, and does a little potted description of what makes them a traditionalist versus an irrationalist. The naturalists, London, Crane, Morris, Reiser, even Cabell, did their most important work between the 90s and the close of the First World War. The primitivists and irrationalists, Anderson, Hemingway, Faulkner, Caldwell, Pound, and Jeffers, belong clearly to the troubled decades between the two world wars, as do those more substantial novelists whose significance is to be read largely in a reaction to the dislocations of the new era. Fitzgerald, Dos Passos, Steinbeck, and Woolf. The first group reflects philosophically the mood of doubt that succeeded the earlier Victorian optimism and the impact of naturalism and of determinism. The second mirrors the disillusionment that came after the Wilsonian Crusade and Republican normalcy, and the flight from reason that was inspired by the final collapse of Newtonian physics, the triumph of Freudian psychology, and the political disintegration of the old world. Both were deeply affected by the economic malaise that furnished the background to so much of American history from the early 90s to the 1930s. So that paragraph has a lot, and it sort of goes on in the next paragraph to even describe the traditionalists as well. But did you get anything of like where he was going with the whole? Why he felt the need to create a typology of writers, like this writer reacted to these changes in this way, and this one reacted in this way, and
I think he was like talking about literature. I think he was trying to maybe give like an overview of what representation. He's talking about these periods and then how literature was affected, and then he's using these authors as examples and of these different types of literature and then their effects. But so what do you think, John?
I don't know. I have a hard time talking about writers as saying Willa Cather, or let me take someone whose work I know a little bit better. I don't know. Pick anyone who's written 10 or 20 novels, and then just using their last name to evoke the entirety of their work and say this is how they handled this or this is how they handled that. Again, it's kind of whitewashing and it's generalizing. And when I read books, no matter who they're by, I like to think about them as, they're all a product of a particular mind and time and place, but I like to respect their individuality as much as I can.
Yeah, I think he gets into Howells a little bit more because he talks about the change in Howells, how he started out as this, this kind of a regional and, it's not the traditionalist, and I'm getting my names all mixed up, but he moves over into the naturalist view because he couldn't put up with it anymore. He writes more about Howells than he does some of these other authors. And I think I liked what he wrote about Howells, actually. I mean, he made him interesting enough to where I would like to read some of his books. And I think it'd be interesting to get, that broad perspective, starting at the beginning and reading some of his early works and then progressing on through and seeing how he changed. But he quoted him some in there, in that book, and I would have to do some searching in my notes to find. I wrote it down, but where he just was tired, he couldn't write like that anymore. He was quoting Howells, is that he couldn't write that way anymore, and he just had to show things for the way they were.
Yeah, I think if you go back and you look at the chronology of Howells' novels, they become noticeably more concerned with economic realities as he goes later on in life. Yeah. And in a very negative way. Like he's critical of what's happening.
Yeah. Yes.
And would you guys say that, because I picked up on that chapter on William Dean Howells, that, and maybe, I think there's a thread going throughout this book of how capitalism impacts these different areas of society. He talks about like the writers in terms of how they reacted to the growth of capitalism or the excesses of capitalism, the corruption. I mean, it seems like that was one of Commager's kind of, big themes.
Yeah.
Or is that just me? Did you pick up on that too,
Nope.
Sharon?
Yep.
Okay.
I think that was definitely a common thread.
Yeah. And and not how it just pops up in literature, but he also, he looks at Thorstein Veblen too, and how he sort of reconfigures the way old economists looked at capitalism and said, well, Veblen comes along. This is later in the book, of course, when Veblen gets his own chapter and says that, America and maybe even Europe, it's no longer a society of capitalism that is to just sustain itself. This is a capitalism that has grown into something gaudy. And it's grown into something that we are just making money to show other people that we make money. That money has no final ends or final uses, like to provide shelter, to provide food, to provide care. It is just pieces of paper that we like to show our friends and family to show that we have it. And that it's during this 30 or 40 year period that transition, which happens to coincide with the Gilded Age, right, which is really corrupt and probably that's not a coincidence that change happens.
Right. So that's what you're talking about, like with the rise of conspicuous consumption, that's why they call it the Gilded Age, along with the corruption. But does he ever really answer why that came about?
Well, he talks about he talks about William Graham Sumner and Fisk. Oh goodness, what's the guy's name he talks about with Sumner? Ward, Lester Ward.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that? I'll tell you which chapter it is. It's
Ward
and the Science of Society, which is chapter 10. So he compares these ideas of Sumner, of Charles Graham Sumner, and he has this sort of laissez-faire attitude towards law and society, and he thinks that society is just the state is there to basically to just so kind of like wind up the clock to provide you with basic, like a military, the very, very fundamentals of what a society would need, and everything else you're on your own for. Society should not provide, anything in the way of like labor restrictions, business regulations, anything like, because it's restrictions on freedom.
Mm.
And that's he's like, sort of like the prototypical like kind of libertarian, but it's not just economic or anything. It's just like everything. Okay. And Lester Ward is interesting because he comes along and he says that, well, the state, when it makes regulations and when it makes laws, may have some people's best interests at heart. Some of these laws, some of these regulations might actually come out being for the better of society. And Sumner, who actually has a book of essays in the Liberty Fund. I don't know if you saw that, Peg.
No, I have not.
Go search his name in the catalog. It was one of the books I ended up buying. That's one of the conversations that's taken up in that chapter. And the prevalent attitude during the time really comes down on the side of Sumner. And so that lack of regulation, of course, leads to a lack of oversight, which makes sense. So if you don't have as much oversight in the legislative and legal and political sphere, you have a lot more corruption.
Corruption. Okay, I see what you're saying.
At least
yeah.
those are the connections that I sort of made. I mean, I'm not sure it's necessarily the case that if you have, a more libertarian society that you have more corruption, but
yeah,
that's what I took from it.
Excellent. Thank you. Sharon, you got any other thoughts on any of that?
Nope. I do
okay.
not.
Well, I'm going to throw out just a few random things that I really jumped out at me. And I know there's something else I think we could all talk about later, because I think we touched on it in our Voxer group. But one of the things that jumped out at me, along with the focus on capitalism and how he thought it, infiltrated, but I mean, how it impacted different aspects of society, how people reacted, in literature, in politics, law, and all that, was this chapter on William James and philosophy. I thought was
I loved.
It was fantastic. It was fantastic, and it was all about. And tell me if you agree with Commager. I think maybe I do, but he says Americans and their philosophy is all about pragmatism.
Yes.
It's like that word just runs throughout this book in different ways. But the philosophy of pragmatism that William James pretty much formulated.
If it works, it's true.
Yes.
If it works, it's true. That's an American thing, it seems to me. And that's what James was all about. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that chapter. Sharon, do you like? I thought you liked the Transcendentalist. Sorry about that, John. I didn't mean to cut you
No.
off.
I wanted to just add one thing really quick, that I thought if there was one go-to chapter that you would keep this book maybe as a reference a reference text, that it was the chapter on William James. If you ever needed to look up anything, you needed a short 20-page précis on William James or what pragmatism was, that was a great excuse to keep the book around.
Agreed.
It's interesting because I'm interested by both transcendentalists and the pragmatists. So, and how they kind of went, from one to the other. And I thought he did a good job in explaining that. Just this flow of the different, the change in thought. So, but I am not well versed in any philosophy. It's just an area of interest of mine. So I don't feel qualified to expound on it more than that. But I enjoyed the chapter on pragmatism. I thought that was really good. I'm kind of surprised, John, that he didn't mention Charles Pierce more than he did. I thought Pierce was highly involved in the pragmatism movement as well.
Pierce was what even came a little bit earlier than James, but he was, I think he became much more famous as a logician and a mathematician. Where James really comes out of the gate straight with a philosophy that's much more suited for pragmatism, which is just like everyday concerns, how we think about things like religion and democracy, and questions that will keep coming up in pragmatists all the way down to John Dewey and even Richard Rorty. But Peirce is more known, I think, for being a logician.
Okay.
But he still very much is a pragmatist. He's just not as. I don't even think his name is mentioned in the book, is it?
Well, that's. No, I think you mentioned him once, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe once, that's what reminded me that he didn't talk about him.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things that he does, that he leaves, that I feel he leaves out of this book.
Yeah.
And that's just one among many.
anyone interested in a history of pragmatism should go and read the Metaphysical Club right away. If you haven't read
I have it on it as an ebook.
Is that nonfiction? Is that history or?
It's a history of ideas. Yeah.
Okay. Great. I'll write that one down.
I'll tell you about it later. It's
Okay.
it's William James. I don't know how much Peirce is in there, again for kind of the same reason, but it's Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and Sr. It's how their lives were affected by the Civil War, and how they all sort of coalesce around these conclusions that form the base of what we think of pragmatism as being. Is like an idea is as useful, or an idea is as true as it is useful. An idea is true if it works, if it produces results.
Which on definition alone, I don't disagree with,
Yeah.
I mean, it works. All American, baby. No. Just kidding.
There was another thing I was that kept popping up even towards the beginning of the book. I was noticing it. It was this theme of, I think I used the word disillusionment or disillusion. At around 1870, 1880, you have this sort of surety. You have this picture of our place in the universe that we're rather, confident in and sure of. And over the next 40 to 50 years, we see things just start to wear away. Darwin sinks into our minds more and more, and we think, well, maybe we weren't. Maybe we're just the latest product in one continuously long line of biological evolution. And then you have this idea of capitalism, of it falling apart in certain ways and becoming crazy and unregulated, and also because of that, so many people having lower standards of living, and just the it seems like modernism, which is kind of where he takes the book up until the very brink of, around right around World War I is where he breaks off the book, 1920 or so. Like modernism is a reaction to everything that he's talking about. Modernism is supposed to be some big break, right, with the past, and it seems like he's discussing a lot of the reasons for why modernism chooses to break with the past. Why? Well, what was the quote from Virginia Woolf? Sometime around December of 1910, the world changed forever, or something like that. And she was talking about the onset of modernism. But I got a sense of things unraveling, of things getting worse and more uncertain and less sure, and there being a sense of social and cultural anxiety setting in.
Yeah, I think I had used the word.
Did that pop out at anyone else?
Yeah, I called it entropy. I think in our Voxer group,
Okay.
It seemed like he was charting out a breakdown from the founding, and he just starts charting how things just started to, like you said, a great unraveling. So it wasn't really a hopeful or positive take on things, or rather than looking at things like, wow, well, we have a new school of art or literature, it was dismissive, I think, in a lot of things. Dismissive of, to go to a point that Sharon made earlier, you sounded kind of dismissive of he called it the psychological school. I think that was the cult of irrationality, Sharon.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of my notes. He called it what it came to be known as the psychological school.
Yeah.
And and he had a very
it's all in the
strong
head. Yeah.
Yeah, he had a strong
I mean,
reaction
basically
to that.
that's, you know, because that's where you get stream of consciousness, and that became, you know, the way you're talking about Virginia Woolf. Of course, she was big on that, and all those authors were writing that way and began writing that way, and it was all, you know, it was no longer physical or external. It was all in their heads, what was going on in their minds, and just a way of, you know, a way of thinking about things and all. It was just, you were actually getting inside their heads instead of looking at external things, instead of looking at plot. There was no plot. Plot was your head. That's that kind of thing. And I think that kind of goes along with what you're talking about. This, you know, and all. And I got the impression when I was reading over this that he was not a fan in any way, shape, or form of the modernist, and that's why he calls it illogical or irrational. I'm sorry, irrational.
And then at the same time, he seems to have this quasi-Whiggish view of at least American history, where he sounds like he has confidence in the American project.
Yeah. So
I mean, it is. I mean, especially if you go back and you look at chapter 1. I mean, that's certainly a conclusion you could get from rereading chapter 1, right? But then you contrast that with all of this dissolution and unraveling, and it's kind of an interesting paradox to think about.
Yeah.
Well, and one thing along with that, you know, when he's talking about the irrationals, he's also talking about expatriates. A lot of those authors went to Europe. Hemingway, of course, Virginia Woolf was from Europe, and you know, there were a number of those authors that actually went over there, and they left the U.S. So I wonder if he's associating that stream of consciousness and that type of writing with people who have left the United States for whatever reason.
Good point.
That's interesting too.
Yeah. I'd like to touch on the chapter on religion, just because religious thought and practice. I think it was chapter 9. I found that, I think, as the only maybe the only religious person in this group. So I'm like the counter. Let me know if I'm talking out of place, but I don't think I am. I thought it was very interesting. Some of the things he pointed out, I personally think still exist with regards to American religious thought and practice. Some of my notes. I love this from page 162. He said there was a unanimity with which Americans profess a religious faith, mostly Calvinistic, and the indifference they displayed to its doctrines, which he tied in with Americans we're just so sunny. We're so optimistic. Gosh darn it, everything around us, we're just so, we have showers of gold falling from heaven. We are blessed. And, you know, it was just one of those wonderful things where I was like, oh, yeah, that is absolutely how people in America tend to think sometimes, especially when it comes to religion. It's like, I should always be blessed. I should always have pennies from heaven, you know? But yeah, I don't care about the doctrines. I really don't need to practice it so much as just do the surface stuff, you know, which is show up to church, but don't walk the walk, just talk the talk, you know. So that whole chapter was like, yeah, I can see where that is definitely ingrained in a lot of the religious, you know, people in America who claim to be religious.
That whole strain of religion, of the superficiality of the ways in which people take it up sometimes is really explored in the book by Hofstadter that we were talking about on Voxer, the anti-intellectualism in the American tradition, whatever that
yeah.
book is called.
Mhm.
I don't know if I think Sharon, you said you had a copy of it.
Yes, I have it.
We should read it sometime. It takes.
Yeah, we should read this one next and do another chat.
No, that's fine.
Hofstadter, I think, is a better writer, and it's none of this sort of rah America stuff either. So I think we might all have a better reaction towards what he's doing. I made it about halfway through the book or so, about 20 years ago when I tried to read it in college, and I didn't stop reading it because I didn't enjoy it. I just got distracted. I really loved what I read though, but I would love to restart it with you two.
Yeah, we definitely should, because well, this was another part that I really appreciated when he said in late 19th and early 20th centuries, religion prospered while theology went bankrupt. And I was like, yes, and more yes. And he just talked about how really there was never a major American religious philosopher or thinker that we produced. And I just don't know if you guys.
Yeah, except like Jonathan Edwards. I mean, you have to go back to the 18th century.
You do, yeah. He mentions Edwards, yeah. But since then, he's like, no.
Yeah.
Because it's all, and this reminds me of like what they call in Christian circles the prosperity gospel. It really divides. It divides a lot of Christians because either you're watching the Joel Osteen thing and, you can be rich. And it's just like, this is not, like I'm in the other camp where, my pastor gets like angry, like this is not what the Bible teaches.
Didn't Jesus tell us to give away all of our money?
Well,
I mean,
well,
I mean,
yeah.
And I don't mean all, but I mean, he certainly didn't say to accrue it in a conspicuous way.
No,
right?
It's just, yes, but I think it ties in with that American personality or that character that Commager talks about, which is, it's wound up in optimism. We're so, and we're all about business, but so it's like when you try to marry that to religion and a belief in God, and then you try to take it out to the public like that and say, hey, it's all about making money, and it's how rich you are shows how blessed you are, and that is heresy to me. I'm just gonna say that right now.
How rich you are shows how what you are?
How blessed you are.
Oh, blessed. Okay.
Yeah, that's why this whole I cannot stand these.
And you need to give your money to me.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, these people are scoundrels.
Guys, I
I'm
really
sorry,
need
but
that 7th jet. I really, really need that 7th jet.
Well, they're spiritual charlatans, and they're playing on people's, hopes and, just economic insecurities. And it's just like, again, it's like religion prospers, but theology dies. And it's like, that's what we need to focus on. It's like this life, you're not actually supposed to have a good time. Sorry, America. I hate to break it to you. In my faith tradition, it's about serving others, and you're going to suffer. But God loves you, and we'll get you through this. And pretty much is a very nutshell type of thing. But you're not here to reap millions without giving back and following doctrine. So it's just superficiality of American religion. It's very shallow.
Yes.
But I find that really just, I can understand why people look at religion and say, hell no, I'm not going there, I get it.
I used to work in a church. I worked in a church for 8 years, and that turned me off completely. Yeah. But where you were talking about, Peg, where he talks about how they act one way Monday through Saturday, and then Sunday they go to church or whatever. And some people, I thought it was really funny we had people who belonged to the church where I worked who would show up twice a year, and we called them C and E's.
Yeah, we call that too.
And,
Yeah.
you know, they thought they were upstanding church members, you know.
Yeah.
And that would take care of all their church obligations for the year.
Yeah.
But it's that same mentality is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I can't stand it either. It gets me riled up, as you can tell.
Yeah. But I left the church because of my experience, what I saw working in it. It was really, really bad. So
sorry that happened. That is,
well,
I think there's how are we doing on time?
you know what? I don't see my timer. We'll just continue until we wrap it up.
Okay, well, I think we started sometime around 6:20 or 25. So
okay, we're about 45 minutes.
My time, at least.
You can just edit me out, Peg. That's fine.
No, we're not.
We're in 3 different time zones to make things more interesting.
Yeah.
So there's this one concept. It's by Eric Vogelin, who he mentioned it in the New Science of Politics back in the early 50s. And it's this phrase that William F. Buckley Jr. became well known for in his show Firing Line and other places. It's called immanentizing the eschaton.
Oh yeah.
Which just means making earthly or making material what we used to think of as heavenly or otherworldly or divine. And that kind of is a theme that pops up over and over again. I mean, before Darwin, we used to think of ourselves as a unique product of God. After Darwin, many people think of human beings as one kind of biological creation. Oh, and I especially thought of this in terms of, let's see, what's the chapter called? The Evolution of American Law, chapter 17, where he talks about how a lot of 17th and 18th century European law, like Blackstone's writings on law, his commentaries on law, were all based largely on assumptions about natural law. Like something is right or wrong because it is in accordance with God's nature. And how changing ideas of jurisprudence during this time period that we're talking about came to see law as much more context dependent, and how things can't be absolutely wrong or right in all contexts, but that depends on what's going on around, the economics of the situation, or the other things about what surrounded the actual act that's in question. So and that kind of I don't know what. Let's see, who is he talking about? He's largely talking about Oliver Wendell Holmes. Here, do you remember the discussions about Oliver Wendell Holmes when he's talking about does he use the term pragmatism again? He's talking about how natural law is not sufficient to rest jurisprudence on, because we're not. That's just it's not something useful. It's not something that he thought brought anything to the table.
But
I don't know how much anyone got anything out of the law section, but I'm fascinated by the history of law and jurisprudence and all of that stuff. So I like it.
I see what you're saying, and I'm looking back at it now, and I realize that I might need to reread that, just because there's a lot of ideas and content in here that I think at first pass, I think I need to check that out a little bit more, because When it comes to natural law, though, wouldn't you say that you would need to base some type of truth on objective truth, or is man-made law?
Well, that's
is
what natural law
subjective?
says.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't just totally disagree with that. So I might be
Yeah.
in the minority.
Well, I mean, there's two poles there, and I'm not sure that, you know, that if you're, I'm not sure that you know, Oliver Wendell Holmes is exactly on the polar opposite end, but he's saying that, you know, there are some times in which, you know, ideas about natural law aren't as helpful as we used to think maybe they were. But one of the problems with the book is that it is what's the word I'm looking for? A gish gallop. Does anyone ever heard that term before? A gish gallop?
No, what is that?
It's like when you're talking to someone and they just they're like they give out just tons and tons of information, you know, in trying to support their point, and then you're like, wait, but they keep going.
Yes.
This is that book.
That
You know?
is a wonderful way to describe it. That is how I felt reading this book. Nope, she's back.
I want, like,
it kicked me out.
just when you were thinking about, you know, you wanted to read a whole book about literature, he's like, here's economics. And just when you were finished reading about economics, he's like, here's law, you know? And it's fast, and there's tons and tons of ideas in here. I mean, if you blink, you miss something important.
Absolutely.
And I mean, and you can't be blamed for not picking up on stuff you're not interested in the first place. But in case you are interested in it, there's stuff there if you want to go back.
Well, I think you're right that this would be useful. This book would be useful as a just to have on the shelf. And if you're doing a study on, you know, philosophy one time, you're like, oh, there was that William James chapter in here. Let me go check that out. Or oh, you know, I want to learn more about the you know, determinism school of writing, you know, whatever. I mean, like you said, there's great chapters in here, but I think you'd have to take it a chapter at a time based on your interest at the time.
Yeah.
Because this was almost it was overwhelming for me. It's like a survey of everything.
Like Sharon said, with notes, you know, and with had this thing had been treated with the annotated, you know, bibliography that it really deserved, it would have an 80-page bibliography at the end, because he talks about so many things, and so sometimes he gives no more than a sentence or maybe a paragraph to something that you could spend a small book discussing.
Mm-hmm.
So
this is true.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yep.
What do you think about wrapping things up?
Yeah, we're going to wrap things up. I wanted to see if you guys had anything to say on the sad figure of Mr. Henry Adams. I know we talked about him a little bit.
Oh.
He was a sad figure.
I just got 2 volumes of his history. The one on it was what, Madison and Jefferson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I think we talked about reading those together too.
I got hang on. This book. I don't know if you can see.
I have that.
I have that too. Yeah.
Oh, do you? Maybe we should buddy read that.
I know.
The biography of Henry Adams. Plus, I have the other 2 books. The one with the French words that I can't pronounce, and which I think is kind of his spin on religion, I guess, or Mount something.
Malchard.
Yeah, I see. I don't speak French.
It's
even hear about it.
He goes to France, and it's basically a discussion of his impressions of like of Catholicism and in the French Gothic cathedrals like Malchard and Notre Dame.
See,
check that out.
I'm interested in the cathedral part of that.
Yeah.
maybe not so much his points on Catholicism, but who knows if he's a good writer, you know.
He is. Yeah. He's got
and I just think he sounds like a fascinating person. And then there's Brooks Adams, who I had never heard of until I read this book. And it's interesting. I am currently reading, and I'm assuming, Peg, that all this is going to get edited out, because this is just me talking to you two.
Well,
but I'm currently a book on the history of blues music, and it's something about it's Negro music in a white world, basically. And Brooks Adams is mentioned twice in that book. And it's like, I would never have known who that was had I not read this book.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other person that the Commager mentions briefly and with very little respect, I thought, is Hearn.
Oh.
And it's I can never pronounce his name. It's Lafcadio Hearn. Yeah. And he's also in this blues book. He mentions him because apparently he translated, I don't know how he would have known to do this, but he translated African songs into English. And it's like, wonder when he did all that, because he was, but again, it's like, I wouldn't have been familiar with him had I not read this book, and his name keeps popping up. So it's interesting. And plus he lived in Cincinnati for 10 years. He was a journalist there and an editor, I think, of what probably the news, it's not in print, it's not anymore, but it might have been like the forerunner of the Cincinnati Enquirer. And that was another interesting chapter in this book, was his spin on journalists. And boy, he's not very happy with Hearst and Pulitzer. Boy, he had a great spin with the Coles.
That's one of the things we didn't even get a chance to talk about.
I know. Well, because there's so much in this book. Just
I know.
For anyone watching, this book is filled to the brim with food. He name drops so much. And like you were saying, Sharon, I think that's there were some good things about this book. And I think it goes to what you said. There's a lot of things I didn't know or people I wasn't aware of that this book brought to mind. It gave me more ideas for further reading, for sure. Overall, maybe a C+.
I gave it, for what it's worth, I gave it 3 stars, and that's because Goodreads does not allow for half stars. I would have given it a 2.5 stars.
Yeah, I gave it a 3 as well. Yeah.
The half star was for all the information that I picked up on these people that I want to read further about.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we've got some ideas.
I think I gave it 4. I probably would have leaned more towards 3.5, but I tried to ease up on him because he didn't have the last 70 years of history to look back on. So I tried to forgive him for a few things that he said, but it was tough. But I enjoyed it just enough to give it a 4.
Nice. Well done. All right. Well, what do you guys think? Did we covered all points pretty much? Well, not all points, but most of them.
I think so.
The ones that excited us the most, yeah.
The ones that excited us, got us riled up.
Our blood pressure up.
Yes. Well, I hope we can do this again soon. I know that we're going to have to settle on our next buddy read. We obviously have Hofstetter waiting in the wings.
Peg, do you have a copy of that?
I do. I got the Library of America version.
Wonderful.
They happened to my subscription. It mailed it to me right as we were talking about it. And I was like,
synchronicity. I love that.
Yeah, I did. I was like, oh my God, I got it now. So we can start that one whenever. But for everyone watching at home, I don't know what channel you're viewing this on. If you're watching on the History Shelf, I really encourage you to go visit John David's channel. I think each one of us are going to have our links to everyone else's channel. Please visit Sharon Goforth's channel. And Sharon, I hope this means you might, rejoin us in the.
Got it.
We keep going here in that direction.
We keep trying to, because Sharon was one of my favorite channels, and you took a little break there. So we hope you come back. We hope this was fun for you.
I might.
Okay, great. So, but I just encourage everyone to go and visit John and Sharon's channel and subscribe and just check out their backlog of fantastic videos. And I think we'll do this again, though. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's great.
All right. Well.
Okay, talk to you guys in about a month or so.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, bye, BookTube. We'll talk soon.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.